What if I told you that in the medieval world, marriage was less a romantic vow and more a death sentence written in fine ink? A system where daughters were traded like coins, wedding nights became public spectacles, and childbirth was a game of Russian roulette you played again and again until either you produced an heir or the grave claimed you. This is the dark, unfiltered truth of medieval marriage, where "till death do us part" was not a promise, it was a timeline. If you dare to uncover the twisted customs and brutal realities our ancestors endured, hit subscribe now. Because once you hear what happened under those candlelit ceilings, you'll never look at marriage the same way again. The story begins in the grand halls of power, where political alliances were forged not in council chambers, but in the wedding contracts of children. At just 6 years old, Margaret Beaufort, an heiress to vast lands and wealth, was handed over in a transaction disguised as a marriage to John de la Pole. She was too young to understand the meaning of the word husband, but the adults around her knew exactly what they were doing, securing her fortune before war or plague could snatch it away. 3 years later, the political winds shifted, and Margaret's first marriage was dissolved as though it had never existed. Her guardians didn't hesitate. They sold her again, this time to Edmund Tudor, a man of 24. She was 12. In theory, the unspoken rule was to wait until the girl turned 14 before consummating the marriage. In reality, Edmund decided not to wait. Within months, Margaret, still a child, was pregnant. Margaret's story was far from unique. In 1396, Isabella of Valois, daughter of the King of France, was married to King Richard II of England at just 6 years and 5 days old. She arrived with dolls in her trousseau, her marriage contract specifying consummation only after her 12th birthday. Even in medieval Europe, where child marriage was common among the elite, this was extreme. For the wealthy and powerful, daughters were not individuals, they were assets. The more land titles or gold a girl carried into marriage, the higher her value in the brutal marketplace of dynastic politics. Wars, plagues, and court intrigues could wipe out fortunes overnight, so parents played the marriage game early, locking in alliances while the ink on their daughters' birth records was barely dry. The church had rules about the legal age for consummation, but politics always shouted louder than morality. For every bishop willing to condemn an early union, there were 10 willing to look away if the match promised gold, influence, or territory. And so, the childhoods of girls like Margaret and Isabella ended not with games or laughter, but with signature seals and the turning of a key in a heavy oak door. Yet, while these elite child marriages shock us today, most medieval people married later peasants and craftsmen in their late teens or early 20s. Child marriage was primarily a disease of the rich, born from the corruption of too much wealth and too much to lose. For those trapped in its grip, however, it was the opening chapter of a lifelong ordeal, because once the vows were said, the humiliation often began immediately. The wedding night, something we think of today as private and intimate, was in many noble households a public event. The bedding ceremony saw family and guests escort the bride and groom to their chamber, undress them and lay them in bed while offering advice or crude jokes about the act to come. In the most high-stakes marriages, witnesses waited just outside the bed curtains for proof of consummation. It wasn't prurience, it was politics. Without consummation, the marriage could be annulled, undoing years of negotiation and endangering entire alliances. To the families involved, this moment wasn't about love, it was about securing property rights, inheritance lines, and political stability. Margaret of York's marriage to Charles the Bold in 1469 became a spectacle of such magnitude that chroniclers recorded every detail of the bedding. Imagine the pressure, dozens of eyes waiting for a sign that the marriage was legally sealed. For child brides like Isabella, even if consummation was delayed, the ceremony was a grim reminder their childhoods were over their bodies, no longer their own. And this was only the beginning of their trial by fire. If the wedding night was a public humiliation, Childbirth was the private horror that followed. For medieval women, especially noble women expected to produce heirs, pregnancy was not a blessing, but a gamble with deadly odds. Every time they conceived, they rolled the dice against a 1 in 3 chance of dying in childbirth or from complications shortly after. Margaret Beaufort's own pregnancy was nothing short of a nightmare. At 13, her body was far too small and underdeveloped for the strain. When her husband Edmund Tudor died of plague, while she was 7 months along, she was forced to make a grueling winter journey to Pembroke Castle, heavily pregnant and entirely alone. On January 28, 1457, Margaret went into labor. Bishop John Fisher, her confessor, later wrote that it was a miracle that a baby could be born of so little a personage. Her body was so fragile that both mother and child were expected to die. Against the odds, they survived, but the damage was irreversible. Margaret would never bear another child, her body permanently scarred by that single traumatic birth. Even with the best medical care available at the time, which amounted to herbal remedies, prayers, and practices that bordered on torture, wealthy women were not much safer. Isabella of Aragon, a princess, died at just 18 after days of agonizing labor. No amount of gold could buy real safety from the medieval birthing chamber. Medical knowledge was primitive and often deadly. Midwives sometimes used birthing chairs designed to speed up delivery, but which caused severe injuries. Bloodletting during labor was a common practice, as if draining a woman of strength was somehow the path to life. And always there was the expectation bear children and bear them quickly. Noble women could expect to go through this cycle of pregnancy and danger 8 to 15 times in their lives. Eleanor of Aquitaine. One of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, survived 10 pregnancies. Many were not so fortunate. Bodies broke under the strain, organs prolapsed. Muscles tore, chronic pain became a lifelong companion. In a world where producing an heir was considered a wife's primary duty in fertility, or simply the inability to produce a male child could be a death sentence, the blame always fell on the woman, even though modern science shows that male infertility accounts for half of all conception problems. Medieval medicine didn't care. If childbirth didn't kill a woman, her husband's legal rights might. Under the doctrine of reasonable chastisement, husbands were allowed to physically discipline their wives, the only limit being that the stick used was no thicker than a thumb. In practice, even this rule was often ignored. Violence was a legal part of marriage. The most infamous example of marital cruelty came from Henry VIII. When his wives failed to produce the male heirs, he demanded he didn't merely divorce them, he executed them. Anne Boleyn was accused of adultery, incest, and treason on the flimsiest of evidence, and beheaded in 1536. Catherine Howard met the same fate at around 19 years old. This wasn't an abuse of medieval marriage law, it was the law functioning as designed. A husband had near total control over his wife's body property, and even her life. Divorce was almost impossible, requiring proof the marriage had never been consummated. That proof often meant humiliating physical examinations, public trials, and years of legal limbo. Legally, a married woman had no independent identity under coverture. Her property, wages, and even her testimony belonged to her husband. She could not sign contracts, sue, or be sued without him. And if he chose to confine her in a remote manor or a locked chamber, few courts would intervene because the law presumed his authority within the household. The economics of this misery were stark. The dowry functioned like an entry fee into a rigged market, with a bride's family paying cash jewels, land, and political promises just to place their daughter, while the groom's family treated the match as an investment expected to yield heirs' estates and leverage returns, secured not by affection but by enforceable customs. Negotiations could drag on for years, like corporate mergers. Scribes compared pedigrees, tallied rents and mills, and calculated what happened if plague struck, if war shifted borders, or if a groom died before consummation, clauses upon clauses ensuring the woman's body and future were collateral in a high-stakes exchange. Once married, the dowry transferred into the husband's control. The bride brought her own purchase price and lost it at the door, and should he die, inheritance laws typically sent property to male relatives, not back to her, leaving countless widows scrambling to remarry for survival, or to seek refuge in convents where bread and silence were cheaper than starvation. Families went into crushing debt to make a good match, selling woodlands, mortgaging mills, pawning heirlooms, only to find that after the ceremony they had no legal recourse if the husband proved violent or neglectful. The money was gone. The alliance locked, the daughter effectively erased from their household ledger. Among elites, the logic felt inescapable. Marry early to freeze alliances before borders moved. Marry upward to climb one rung. Marry again if death intervened, repeat until fortune or extinction. And beneath the heraldry and Latin vows, the human cost accumulated like unpaid interest. Death, meanwhile, kept the clock, with average unions ending after 15 to 20 years. Due to war plague or childbirth, remarriage became a grim reflex. Bans were read weeks after funerals, dowry chests reopened, stepchildren reshuffled, and households reassembled as if grief itself had a timetable. Parish registers read like a ledger of contingency plans. John wed Mary, died in childbirth. John wed Alice, died of pestilence. John wed Margaret. Outlived him, remarried Thomas. This churn produced tangled kinships, half-siblings, step-siblings, rival heirs, fuel for lawsuits and feuds that could smolder for generations. Emotion adapted to the market. People learned not to tie their hearts too tightly where the law tied their lives so absolutely, and yet tenderness still surfaced in letters and marginal prayers, in a lock of hair folded into a missal, brief proofs that affection persisted even under rules designed to price it out. And still the rituals marched on torches, at dusk bedding songs the priest's blessing, over a bed that doubled as courtroom and counting house, every sigh recorded in someone's memory as evidence. Because in medieval marriage, the body was a contract, the sheet a witness, and the future a debt signed in two names, hers, which vanished, and his, which owned the ink. For the wealthiest, even death didn't always free them. Prenuptial clauses and inheritance disputes could bind a widow to her late husband's family, forcing her to live under their roof and control until she agreed to remarry someone of their choosing, effectively turning grief into another transaction. Some women learned to play the game with ruthless skill, accumulating land and influence, through a series of strategic marriages, each one chosen to strengthen their position. Margaret Beaufort herself, despite her brutal start, became one of the richest and most politically powerful women in England, mastering the very system that had nearly destroyed her. But for every Margaret who outmaneuvered the rules, hundreds more were swallowed by them, girls married into abusive households with no escape, mothers who buried child after child until their own health failed, widows cast out into poverty when they could no longer bear heirs or attract suitors. Public life offered little reprieve. A woman's behavior was policed relentlessly with gossip, functioning as both surveillance and weapon. Rumors of adultery, witchcraft, or political disloyalty could strip her of reputation, and under the law justify punishment as severe as imprisonment or execution. In the courts, women were often voiceless. Their words carried no weight unless repeated by a male guardian or husband, and even noblewomen learned to cultivate allies who could speak for them, brothers, uncles, or even sympathetic clerics who might shield them from the full force of a husband's will. Religion sanctified the imbalance. Sermons framed female obedience as divine duty, citing scripture to reinforce legal subjugation, while saints' lives held up models of silent suffering as spiritual triumph, subtly teaching women that endurance, not resistance, was the path to salvation. Yet beneath this piety, the Church also profited from the marital economy, charging fees for dispensations to marry close kin for annulments for the reading of bans. In some dioceses, the marital paperwork alone could finance a bishop's household for a year. The constant shadow of mortality meant that marriage was as much about succession as it was about survival. Noblemen calculated the odds of an heir before the bride had even stepped into the chapel, while families of lesser means prayed for a match that wouldn't end in bankruptcy or early widowhood. Love, when it appeared, was almost accidental, flaring in letters smuggled past guards and brief glances during feasts, in whispered promises made under the cover of night. But the machinery of marriage could grind such tenderness to dust if it conflicted with alliance or property. And always the vow, "Till death do us part," echoed with an honesty that was almost cruel. Not a poetic flourish, but a practical truth. For death was the only certain escape from the web of law, faith, and finance that bound two people together in a contract where one always had more power than the other. For the peasantry, marriage carried fewer political stakes, but similar vulnerabilities. Land and livestock replaced titles and estates. Yet the transfer of a dowry cow or a small plot of fields could still spark disputes that ended in lifelong feuds between families. In small villages, public memory was long. The way a marriage began could mark a couple for decades, with whispers about unpaid dowries, broken promises, or scandalous courtships resurfacing at every market day or church gathering. While common folk often married for companionship or shared labor, economic necessity still dictated much of the match, two families pooling resources to survive a harsh winter or to afford new tools. The marriage bed is much a place of economic alliance as affection. Even here, the church's grip was strong. Bans had to be read aloud for 3 consecutive Sundays, giving the community a chance to raise objections, and local priests could block a match if it violated canon law, often requiring a costly dispensation to proceed. In wealthier households, the spectacle of the bedding ceremony persisted, though often in symbolic form. Friends escorted the couple to the bedchamber, offered blessings or bawdy jokes, and left them to their privacy. But the ritual's purpose remained the same: public acknowledgement of a union meant to endure until death. Regional customs could alter the mood. In parts of Scandinavia, public bedding was a legal requirement, with witnesses obliged to ensure the marriage was consummated. While in Southern Europe, the emphasis might be on elaborate dowry processions, the bride's trousseau paraded through the streets as a visible sign of her value. For noble women, however, marriage remained a public performance from start to finish. Their lives were chronicled in court records, letters, and portraits. Every birth or miscarriage noted, every alliance measured by its impact on the balance of power. Chroniclers rarely recorded the cost to the women themselves: days of dangerous labor, years of physical pain, or the grief of burying children before they could speak. Their stories were filtered through the lens of dynasty, as though their bodies were extensions of the realm's borders. Among the lower classes, widows sometimes gained rare independence, managing a household, controlling property, and choosing whether to remarry. Yet even this freedom was precarious, often stripped away if a male relative claimed guardianship or if the widow's assets became attractive to a suitor with stronger legal standing. In every stratum, from palace to pasture, the institution of marriage was less about the hearts that entered it, and more about the structures that enclosed them: law, faith, economy, and death, each one tightening the knot until it was impossible to tell whether it bound in love or in chains. In times of war, marriage became a weapon as much as a refuge. Noble daughters were offered to rival houses to seal fragile truces. Their futures gambled on the hope that a shared bloodline might keep swords sheathed for a generation. Sometimes these unions failed spectacularly, alliances crumbling within months, leaving the bride stranded in hostile territory, a living reminder of broken promises and a convenient scapegoat for renewed violence. The bride's family might never see her again, save for carefully scripted letters that passed through censors. In reality, she could be living in fear, her body and loyalty constantly questioned by in-laws who saw her as an outsider, or worse, a spy. Even within supposedly stable marriages, political suspicion could turn deadly. A husband who found his wife's connections inconvenient might accuse her of treason, witchcraft, or infidelity charges that could destroy her without the burden of proof. Trials were often public theater, where the verdict was predetermined, and the purpose was not justice but demonstration to remind everyone that a woman's power, however great, existed only at her husband's pleasure. Execution was not the only fate. Imprisonment in a remote fortress or confinement in a convent could be equally effective in erasing a wife from public life, silencing her voice while her property and influence were redistributed. Those who survived such purges often emerged shadows of themselves, stripped of allies and wealth, existing only as footnotes in the chronicles that once celebrated their marriages as triumphs of statecraft. For commoners, the stakes were humbler, but no less harsh. Domestic violence could be excused, as discipline abandonment left a wife destitute, and desertion by a husband might force her into begging servitude or sex work simply to survive. Communities sometimes intervened, but usually only if the abuse threatened social stability. Neighbors might pressure a violent husband to relent, not out of compassion, but because his actions risked scandal or disruption to the village's fragile economy. In every case, the pattern was the same. The institution of marriage claimed to provide protection and stability, but more often it functioned as a cage whose locks were held by one party, leaving the other to endure, adapt, or perish within its walls. And yet, despite its cruelties, marriage remained nearly inescapable. For most women, it was the only socially acceptable path to survival, the only way to secure shelter, protection, and a place in the community, however conditional those things might be. Remaining unmarried often meant life on the margins, reliant on the charity of relatives consigned to menial labor, or pushed into the cloister where vows of poverty and obedience replaced the vows of marriage, but offered little more personal freedom. Some women tried to delay or avoid marriage by claiming religious vocations, but even nuns were not entirely safe from the politics of dynastic ambition. Wealthy convents could be pressured to accept daughters as a way to remove them from inheritance lines. For men, marriage was a tool to expand influence, acquire property, and secure heirs. For women, it was a threshold beyond which most legal and personal autonomy ended, no matter their birth rank or prior freedoms. The law wrapped itself around the institution, enforcing obedience through doctrine and precedent, so that even acts of kindness between spouses were framed in terms of duty rather than mutual choice. Stories of love and loyalty did exist, couples who defied the odds and formed genuine bonds of respect and partnership, but such accounts were treasured precisely because they were exceptions, not the rule. In literature and ballads, romance was often portrayed as something separate from marriage, even in conflict with it. Tales of tragic lovers like Tristan and Isolde resonated because they acknowledged the chasm between personal desire and marital obligation. And through it all, the ever-present specter of death loomed, ensuring that even the most enduring marriages would eventually be cut short, often far sooner than either partner imagined when they first clasped hands at the altar. The churn of remarriage, the recycling of alliances, and the constant reshuffling of families gave medieval society its restless, unstable rhythm, a rhythm dictated as much by the grave as by the church bell. In the end, medieval marriage was not merely a private contract, but a public mechanism, part economic policy, part political strategy, part survival. Gamble, binding two people together in a pact where love was optional, duty was inescapable, and death was the only reliable way out.